epidemic. So the learning objectives for this session will be to define an epidemic, importance to control epidemic, types of epidemic, steps in investigation epidemic, and few examples. So if you look at the diagram of the trend of malaria cases in 2011-2014 in monsoon season, we can see in the year 2014 there is a sudden increase in the number of malaria cases. So this is what we commonly refer to as an epidemic. So how do you define an epidemic? Occurrence of disease in a frequency which is clearly in excess of normal expectancy. So what do you mean by normal expectancy? Suppose a disease which has occurred, 100 cases of a particular disease has occurred in a particular area in a year, and next year there is a sudden increase by to 500 cases. So that is not expected to occur in that particular area. So whenever a disease occurs clearly in excess of the expected normal expectancy, we tend to refer it to as an outbreak. So for our understanding, we can have an idea regarding when do you consider a disease as an epidemic. Whenever the disease occurs more than two standard deviations corresponding to time and geographical area in the past 3 years, we can safely assume that it is an epidemic. So what are the various types of epidemic that we have? So according to time, there are two ways by which you can classify: calendar time and natural time. So in the calendar time, we have the short fluctuation, long-term fluctuation, and in natural time, we have the season fluctuation and cyclical fluctuation. So under the short-term fluctuation, we have the common vehicle epidemic and the propagated epidemic. Long-term trends, of course, it is mostly towards the non-communicable disease. Seasonal fluctuation, malaria, dengue, and cyclical fluctuation, we have diseases like measles. But public health point of view, what we are more interested in when we are talking about control of epidemic is common source epidemic and propagated epidemic. So common source, as the name itself suggests, where the source of infection is from one single point of time. That is, common source epidemic can be common source single exposure, common source continued exposure, common source interrupted exposure. So this is one of the very important types of epidemic. When it comes to propagated epidemic, we have a disease like measles, mumps, or even vector-borne disease like malaria. So all this can be classified under the heading of a propagated epidemic. So now with this basic understanding, let us try to understand what are the various steps in the investigation of an epidemic. The first step of investigation epidemic, which is very important, is to verification of diagnosis. Verification of diagnosis, whether what is the disease that we are investigating. That is with the support of the lab, we need to verify the diagnosis of the disease. Second step, another very important step is confirming the existence of an epidemic. So how do you confirm the existence of an epidemic? Is by comparing with the previous year's cases, or whatever the previous data which was available to us, compare the present data with the previous data. By this we can confirm the existence of an epidemic. Then next step in the investigation outbreak is to develop initial line listing. So now what is this line listing? Line listing is nothing but doing the complete enumeration of all the reported cases is what is called as the line listing of cases. Step 4, the next step in the investigation outbreak is defining the population at risk. One aspect we always have to remember in epidemiology, not all sections of the population are equally at risk of developing a particular disease. So we need to identify in a given outbreak who are the population who are at risk, because the chances of them suffering the disease are more than others. So that is one aspect which you should not forget. Step 5 is developing valid case definition. So whenever we are investigating a disease of unknown etiology, it is very important to develop a valid case definition. What do you mean by case definition? So when you are surveying for all the cases, you need to know what are the clinical features which will make you suspect that person is having a particular disease. That's what I mean by you specify those clinical features. The step number 6 will be developing an epidemiological case sheet. For most of the common infectious diseases which like gastroenteritis or food poisoning, we already have the well developed epidemiological case sheets. Even if you don't have, you can easily prepare one. So this will contain the information regarding the onset of the reporting of the first case, then mode of transmissions, probable source of food, how many cases. So all that information will be available in the epidemiological case sheet. Then once you have done this, now you need to prepare your lab to receive more samples to for the analysis. So once having done this, the next aspect will be to contact the administration and other support staff who may be required to initiate the control measures. Then once you are done with this, then with your field staff you need to start collection of information. So once you collect the information, the next important step which comes is doing the descriptive epidemiology. That is, when you describing the epidemic in terms of time, place and person. So what you do after doing this? After doing descriptive epidemiology, you are developing the hypothesis regarding the causation of the epidemic. So it's a good practice in epidemiology to always develop an alternative hypothesis, and then the next step in the investigation outbreak is to use experimental epidemiological methods to test your hypothesis. So after this, the next step will be obtaining final lab proof and then establishing the cause effect relationship. So after this, we need to submit a report of the outbreak which will contain the information regarding the investigation, control measures undertaken, and then finally step number 14 is declaring the epidemic is over. So number one, the steps in the verification of epidemic. So it is usually done by a non-medical person, uh, and the report is in the form of a particular diagnosis. For example, it could be a diarrhea outbreak or a high grade fever. So it is not done by a doctor but a paramedical person. Then confirm the presence of an epidemic. Here you are comparing the number of cases, calculate the rate of disease with the previous year, and then obtain the data. So in this class today we have understood about the definition of epidemic, classification of epidemic, as well as the steps in the investigation of epidemic.